There's been a slight shift of momentum in the last few days, with Ukrainian forces pushing up to 6 kilometers through Russian positions in some areas and retaking roughly 40 square kilometers of territory. The front has been pretty fluid since this offensive kicked off, and it's no different right now, but there do appear to be some Ukrainian gains confirmed by both sides just west of Vuhledar. This is one of the areas that's seen the focus of offensive action over the last week or so, with the other two being Bakhmut to the northeast and the Tokmak access to the west. Now, Vuhledar is actually where Ukrainian forces saw some progress on day one, but it sounds like they were pretty quickly pushed back, with Russia eventually stabilizing those lines. In the most recent push, over the last 24 hours or so, sources from both sides have shared that Ukraine has taken 3 to 4 settlements and appear to be focusing their forces towards Staromayorsky. This is from Deep State maps showing some of the recaptured territory in blue, with unknown status being applied to that gray area between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Additionally, there were some reports coming out about Ukrainian forces taking Makarivka, but shortly thereafter, Russia announced they had retaken that area, and it's not exactly clear where that sits right now. And then here's a quick look at that same map as a comparison from June 7th to June 11th in that same area. Official Ukrainian sources have started to comment on progress of the offensive, which is great. I mean, Ukraine did a pretty impressive job of keeping even the average soldier from updating their position or showing their progress, but that also left a pretty big void in the information space, which Russia promptly filled. And overall, we get a much clearer picture of what's actually happening when we can compare sources from both sides. In terms of how the Russians are viewing this Ukrainian progress, mill blogger and former soldier Russ Marsov recently posted to Telegram that nobody expected this first line of defense to hold, adding that in the fighting around Remivka, his old position was lost, including an additional 10 kilometers behind the front lines, concluding by saying that it's too early to draw conclusions as to how this fight will shake out. War Gonzo, another pro-Russian military blogger, said that alarming trends at the front continue to grow. His concern appears to be that Russian troop presence and equipment at the front has been exaggerated, and they might not have the necessary equipment on hand to stop a main effort-sized attack. And he concluded by asking that additional resources be poured into the area in the very near term. The general mood from Ukrainian accounts is that things are positive, trending in the right direction, and on the Russian side, it's still cautious optimism, but most are repeating the concern that they've not yet faced the main effort of the Ukrainian attack. When looking at Ukrainian progress over the last few days, it's worth noting that they haven't yet reached the main Russian line of defense. Now, the area they've pushed through has been occupied and defended by Russian soldiers. I mean, we've got plenty of footage over the last few days to confirm that. But what is likely the most extensive defensive network is probably another 10 to 20 kilometers into Russian territory. Brady Africa has done a great job mapping Russian defensive positions using satellite imagery. And from that, you can sort of tell where these primary defensive zones sit. Now, these are areas and objects that are easily identifiable from above, so think concrete pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, long trench networks, and gun emplacements. Now, I've very roughly overlaid his map with a recent map of territorial control to give an idea of where the current line sits in reference to some of the more robust defensive positions. What's not marked on this map are individual foxholes and hastily dug fighting positions that make up the bulk of the forwardmost line. Those frontline defenders, as we've seen play out over the last week or so, are pretty heavily reliant upon minefields, anti-tank guided missiles, aircraft, and artillery to stop any sort of attack. So as a rough estimate here, based off of this very professional overlay, I might add, if Ukrainian forces are currently fighting in and around Makarivka, which appears to have traded hands a bit over the last day or so, then the next major Russian defensive position they would run into is approximately 15 kilometers to the southeast or 11 kilometers to the southwest. Ukraine getting through that anywhere is a serious task for sure, but it's also sort of step one before moving into what is believed the primary zone of defense. The way to differentiate these two is that the front line will be the forwardmost position where Ukrainian or Russian soldiers are able to dig in with some degree of cover. The second and then subsequent lines are those better situated from a tactical and operational perspective to halt a large-scale attack. So when you hear Russian media talking about no rupturing of the lines or no operational breakthrough, most of the time they're looking at the second or even the third layer of defense rather than the first. Now, from Ukraine's perspective, they have to get through the first line of defenses to get to the second, have to get through the second to get to the third, and so on and so forth. And I haven't seen any Ukrainian sources suggest that this offensive is over just because they've advanced a few kilometers into one or two areas. It's simply an area they have to move through to carry the fight forward. Now, a Ukrainian official mentioned recently that the immediate priority is reducing Russian artillery superiority, which may give us a hint of what's to come. What he was getting at was, as Ukrainian forces advance into this layered defense, Russian artillery begins to open fire, which is part of that defensive plan, which in turn gives away their position and opens them up to counter-battery fire. Then over time, as those positions are destroyed, it may open a gap for Ukrainian forces to press forward to take on the second line of defenses, ideally able to attempt that breach without the constant barrage of Russian artillery. Now, big picture, Russia outguns Ukraine on the artillery front, both in terms of howitzers and ammunition, but at a specific place in the battlefield that could be altered for a short period of time. With a concerted effort, it's not crazy that Ukraine could significantly reduce the Russian artillery along one axis of advance just long enough to bring their forces into direct fire engagements with those defenders. If you're thinking that Russia will just move more artillery to that spot, you're probably right, but there's a delay associated with that, and it forces Russia to make that decision to remove artillery from one portion of the front to reinforce another. And even if that decision is made incredibly fast, it could be hours or even days before that battery is moved and in position at their new location. Another big question in coming days will be around Russian counterattacks in the areas where Ukraine has seen success. Now, Russia does have localized mobile forces in reserve all across the front for just this type of event, but it's not clear if they would choose to commit those forces now or wait to use them at a later date. Overall, it's still the early days of the Ukrainian offensive, and I'm not sure we've seen their main force committed yet. For starters, this is a pretty significant front. From Bakhmut to Orikhiv, we're talking about nearly 300 kilometers. Now, within that, there's only really 3 main areas of attack right now, but being spread out over that distance creates significant challenges in terms of logistics and keeping the fight moving forward. In a recent interview with The Economist, an unnamed source in the Ukrainian military said, quote, "We haven't committed our main forces, and the Russians haven't committed their main forces," end quote. And he added that both sides right now are in a bit of a chess game trying to draw out the other's reserves. I think that's probably accurate. I mean, given that upwards of 12 new brigades were trained and equipped by Ukraine's allies for just this operation, it seems like a lot of those have yet to be seen. I mean, yes, a few Leopards and Bradleys were all over the internet for a few days, but that's just a small percentage of overall equipment sent, not to mention what Ukraine already had. These assaults against Russian lines over the last week or so have been serious and at a much higher intensity than we've seen in a long time, but the numbers don't quite add up yet. And so long as Russia thinks that Ukraine has more to throw in the fight, they can't overly commit in any one direction. That makes me think that Ukraine is still holding a sizable force in reserve, and there could be a few reasons for that. First is to exploit any success on the battlefield, which is precisely what some of these pro-Russian military bloggers are worried about happening near Vuhledar. The second is to open up another offensive front beyond the current 3. It could be something that was planned or maybe as a reaction to the current situation on the ground, but just one more area to press into and see what happens. The third is a little more pessimistic, but a realistic question that attacking forces have to answer. Are you willing to go all in on this operation? Yes isn't always the right answer. It's possible that Ukraine is keeping a few brigades back, so in the event that this offensive fails, they still have adequate forces for the defense should Russia attempt a counter. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.